All right. Good morning, church. How are we doing? I would like to welcome you officially to week one of a brand new series that we are going to roll through called Navigate. And before we get anywhere in this series, I want to explain kind of the why behind it. So, a little while ago, a friend of mine sent me an article that was all about the decline of church in our culture. Great way to start a sermon talking about the decline of church. And according to an organization called the Pew Research Center, as early as 30 years ago, I bet this will surprise you, as early as 30 years ago, some 67% of Americans were involved in and supported a local church. 67%. Pretty surprised to read that myself. But according to their most recent survey done in 2013, that number has fallen from 67 to 37%. So let's just pack it up. We're done here. Now, the article was written, obviously a lot of people are asking why. Why this decline? Why this shift? That's a monumental shift in the culture of this country to the point that people no longer classify America as necessarily a Christian nation and not a non-Christian nation, but the term that they use is a post-Christian nation. And the fastest growing groups of people demographically are what they call nuns and duns, people that claim no religious affiliation or people that have heard it, they used to subscribe to it, now they're done with it altogether. And this has got a lot of people asking the question, why the shift? Why the decline? Why the change? And the article that my friend sent me was really written to answer that specific idea. So I'm going to quote from that article exactly what they said. Here's what they said. They said, there are a variety of reasons why churches have seen a decline in those attending gatherings. The primary reason, however, is that the church has become mostly irrelevant to the lives of everyday believers. Irrelevant. See, a lot of people, regardless of whether they'd say this out loud, specifically to me, because I'm a pastor, a lot of people have a tendency to view the Bible as pretty words on dead paper that might have been useful at one time or another, but don't have a whole lot to say to people living 2,000 years later across the Atlantic Ocean. In other words, they just view the Bible as really unable to help us navigate this life. And it's really that idea specifically that I would love to speak to in this series. In the New Testament letter known as 2 Timothy, in chapter 3, we find this really, really amazing statement. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, it says this. It says, all Scripture is inspired by God and is profitable for teaching, for rebuking, for correcting, for training in righteousness. And it's this end phrase that really catches my attention. It says, so that the man of God may be complete and equipped for every good work. That is an amazing claim for any book to make. I promise you this, no matter how long any piece of literature has stayed on the New York Times bestseller list, no piece of literature that finds its origin in people would dare to make that claim, or people would pick it apart endlessly. There's a whole lot of books that can claim to make you equipped for, a few good works in one area of life, like relationships or finances or growing a business or what have you. But what the Bible is unapologetically claiming right there is that it can help you and I navigate absolutely every area of life. And over the next 5 weeks, I would like to prove that. So for the next 5 weeks, we're going to look at 5 passages that help us navigate some of the most difficult and confusing situations in life, situations that you may be very surprised to learn the Bible even speaks to at all. So throughout this series, we are going to talk about navigating the wonderful world of politics. We're going to talk about navigating the workplace, especially when you got a boss that is really tough to work for. We're going to talk about navigating the search for happiness, something we've all been looking for our entire lives. We're even going to talk about navigating suffering. But today, to launch this series, we're going to talk about navigating relationships with people who live and believe differently than you do. So we're going to answer one very specific question this morning, and it's actually a question that I've heard a number of people in one way, shape, or form ask me recently. That question is this: how do I live out my faith in front of people who do not share it? And believe it or not, that is a question that a guy named Peter answered specifically for us in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. And it just dawned on me, why don't we go ahead and read that and talk about it since we're here anyway, all right? 1 Peter chapter 2, 11 and 12 says this: Dear friends, I urge you, as strangers and temporary residents, to abstain from fleshly desires that war against you. Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that in a case where they speak against you as those who do what is evil, they will, by observing your good works, glorify God on the day of visitation. So if you're here today and you claim to be a follower of Jesus, I don't really think I need to explain why this passage is valuable for you, because I'm sure that there are people in your life that you care about very deeply that do not share your faith, and so you've asked the question, well, how do I live it out in a way in front of them that's impactful and appealing and agreeable and could maybe get them to see the validity of this whole Jesus thing? And if you've ever thought that or asked yourself that question, this teaching and more importantly, this passage was really written for you. But maybe you're here today and you're skeptical to the truth claims of Christianity. You're not sure what you think of the Bible. You certainly wouldn't identify as a Christian, and so maybe you're wondering, well, what on earth a teaching like this could have for you. But believe it or not, if that's where you're coming from, I actually think this is a great week for you to join us for one main reason. That's because this passage is going to give you a clear glimpse at what Christianity was always supposed to look like. And more specifically, it's going to show you how people who claim to be followers of Jesus have always been called to interact with people just like you, people who don't share their faith. And my hope and my belief in just these two verses is that you're going to see a version of Christianity that is a whole lot more compelling, a whole lot more palatable, and a whole lot more reasonable than what you've seen, heard, or maybe even experienced yourself. So the question is, how do I live out my faith in front of people who don't share it? We're going to start in verse 11, which says this: Dear friends, I urge you, as strangers and temporary residents, to abstain from fleshly desires that war against you. How do you live out your faith in front of people who don't share it? Here's the first answer to that question we see right here in verse 11. Number one, you focus on yourself before you focus on anyone else. See, what I love about this idea and this concept that we find in verse 11 is that it runs completely against the grain of how we all naturally tend to think and live. All you have to do is watch two people enter into an argument one time, and the first place that our minds always revert to when we're interacting with somebody who disagrees with us is how we can get them to change. Verse 11 starts with the complete opposite viewpoint. What you see in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11 is the first person the Bible points you to if you want to influence anybody else is yourself. And this might really surprise you if you weren't raised in the church or you're new to this or you're not a Jesus follower yourself. This might really surprise you to hear. But followers of Jesus, according to this book, should always be more aware of and more focused on where they need to change than where anybody else does. And one of the telltale signs, one of the clearest indicators that you really are getting closer to God is that you're becoming increasingly more aware of your sin and the areas of your life that need to change than you are of anybody else's. And my conviction is that one of, if not the primary reason that followers of Jesus lose credibility in any culture is because they fail to begin with this idea. If you just track the last 200 years, historically, the main complaint or criticism or rock that I think in a lot of cases is justified that culture is thrown against the church is hypocrisy. It's the idea that Christians are at least perceived as having no trouble telling everybody else how they need to live while simultaneously disregarding their own advice. And that is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. And this, what we're talking about, is not even an exclusively Christian idea, because not only will a Christian lose influence when they disregard this principle, but so will a parent, so will a teacher, so will a boss, so will absolutely anybody in any kind of influential leadership position. You've heard it said before that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care, which is true. People also don't care how much you know until they see how much it's changed you. And it's funny, in the weeks leading up to this series, when I was debating whether or not I was even going to do it and whether or not I was specifically going to go to this verse, I had a number of, it was specifically parents coming up to me with really the same issue on their plate. And what I've noticed is a lot of times God will kind of use those things just to let me know that it's time to start speaking to those questions. So I had a number of parents the last couple of weeks coming up to me dealing with the reality that their children that are now growing up may very well not share the faith that they themselves claim. And so they're in a place that they've never found themselves in before, and they're wondering, well, how can I, positively impact my kids with my faith? Because on the one hand, you don't want to go down the road of being too pushy and beat them over the head and drive them away and turn them off, and now, there's walls up and there's no relationship at all. On the other hand, you don't want to be so passive that you just kind of stand on the sidelines of their life and you let them drive off of a cliff when you know that, man, if you just had a relationship with Jesus and so you're kind of walking that tightrope, and maybe you find yourself there as well. And if you do, here's a sobering truth just for parents that parents can pull from verse 11. It's this. This hits me squarely in the chest. Here's what I see for just parents here. It is utterly irrational for us to expect our kids to take a relationship with God seriously if the only difference between us and an atheist is where we sit on a Sunday morning. I don't even like hearing that, but it's the truth. And maybe some of you were raised in homes like that, where your parents, one or both of them, claimed some kind of title like Lutheran or Methodist or Christian or Catholic, and maybe they brought you every once in a while to a weekend service, whatever they called that, and you were raised in a home where that's where faith in God stopped. It didn't impact how they spent their money. It didn't impact how they spent their time. It didn't impact how they treated people. It was just a Sunday morning thing. And if you were raised in an environment like that, you know how utterly unconvincing that version of faith, if we even want to call it, really is. And one of the things that I'm so thankful for when I look back on my childhood is that my parents showed me that they were more than just Sunday morning Christians. I can't remember a time in my entire childhood when my parents were not opening up their home so that somebody else could be counseled and cared for and find healing. I remember person after person found just a safe spot to just be in my home when they were, recovering from a financial crisis or just dealing with something emotionally devastating, or, their marriage was on the rocks, or they were bouncing back from an addiction and they didn't have anywhere else to go. I remember seeing people in my house just crying when my parents were just loving on him. And I remember my dad, when he was like in his mid-50s, opening up his home every week for like a kind of high school, college-age Bible study, which surprises me more and more that I think about it, because my dad doesn't even like people. The only people he's ever met that he liked are like my kids. Yeah, like I don't even make that list. But every week he would let them in his home, and I remember he'd flick the lights in the kitchen, which was the most polite way you can possibly tell somebody to get out of your house. But then he'd let them come back in 7 days. I don't remember a time when they weren't doing that. And what they showed me in living that kind of life is that their relationship with Jesus did a whole lot more than just change where they spend a Sunday morning. It changed how they went through life. And a lot of us, I know, this is my desire. I know I'm speaking for a lot of us. We all want a faith that changes our children's lives. But if that's what we want, then what we always have to ask ourselves is, has my faith changed mine? Or am I just going through life basically the same way that I would have anyway? Am I still chasing after the same things that everybody else is, playing the same games that everybody else is? I've just kind of sprinkled a little bit of God, for about an hour a weekend. Has my faith really changed my life? That's what a passage like this forces us to ask ourselves. Now, when you talk about how a faith in Jesus, a relationship with Jesus should change your life, of course that raises the question, well, how should it change our lives? And there's a lot of different answers to that question, but what it specifically says here in verse 11 is that your relationship with Jesus should cause you to abstain from fleshly desires. Let's get weird. I'm willing to bet that something popped into your mind when you hear the phrase fleshly desires. What probably popped in your mind is some version of sexual immorality. You might be surprised to know this. That is not what Peter's talking about here. The word that Peter uses that gets translated desires is the Greek word epithumia. And I heard a pastor explain it this way. What an epithumia is, just very simply, it's an over-desire. See, the Bible teaches that the primary reason with people is not really just that we desire bad things, it's that we desire good things to bad degrees. There's a lot of things that are good that God has given us access to, that we allow a good thing to become a God thing, and then the whole thing breaks, right? That's basically, the story of mankind start to finish in the Bible. And epithumias are over desires. They're very subtle because they're anything that can challenge the place that only God deserves in your life. anything that really rivals where he deserves to be. And so an epithumia isn't even necessarily a bad thing. It can even be a good thing. Your career can be an epithumia. The Bible has a lot to say about working hard and the value of that. But the moment that your career becomes something that you're investing every part of you in, even to the detriment of other responsibilities, when you're abandoning your family or your children or your spouse or whatever it is, then your career is no longer your career, it's your God. It's the same thing with money. There's a lot of verses that talk about the value of having wealth and financial security, and that's a good thing, and that's a blessing from God. And there's a lot of passages that talk about wisdom when it comes to dealing with finances. But when money becomes the focal point of our lives, when we never feel like we have enough, when we're constantly obsessing over getting more of it, when we're always worried about not having enough of it, when we view our finances as primarily just ours, and the thought of helping, using our finances to help with ministry or help the people that God's placed into our life never even comes to our mind, then money is no longer in its rightful place in our lives. And we could do this with anything. Absolutely anything can be an epithumia. But what Peter is saying here is that if we want to live lives in which our faith is impacting the people that God's placed around us, it's not enough to just make sure that we're not doing any of the openly, obviously, blatantly bad things like murder and adultery and whatever else. That's not enough. That if we're serious about this, then what that means is that we need to, as a lifestyle, be constantly willing to look into our own lives, into our own hearts, letting God's word search us, letting the people that God's placed in our life speak to us, making sure that nothing, not even a good thing, is competing with the place that only God deserves in our lives. Because at the end of the day, we don't get to tell people how satisfying a relationship with God is when we're looking to everything other than God for satisfaction. So the first thing that this passage points us to is ourselves, and reminds us that as we seek to live out our faith in the public square in front of people who don't share it, we need to focus on ourselves more than we focus on anyone else. Right after this, we see this in the first half of verse 12. It says, "Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles." I just want to pause here. So right after this passage speaks to how we should conduct our lives privately, it now speaks to how we conduct that life publicly among Gentiles. In other words, among people who don't share our faith. And so again, how do you live out your faith in front of people who don't share it? This is our second idea that we can pull from this passage this morning. Number two, you have to meet people where they are. But a lot of people talk about wanting to make a difference in the lives of other people, but they're not willing to meet those people where they are. They're not willing to play that kind of long game. There's always been a tendency, especially in churches, to kind of revert to this mindset that's like, I refer to it as a holy huddle, where we expect people, to think like us and live like us and talk like us and then come to us. And the problem with that is that not only is it the exact opposite of what Peter's talking about here, it's the exact opposite of what Jesus had in mind when he designed this thing called the church. The very first time that Jesus spoke of the church in the Bible, he uses this metaphor that's really interesting. He says that he's going to build his church, and then he says, "And the gates of hell will not prevail against it." And that metaphor, really what that metaphor does is it shows us so much about what Jesus desires people who claim to represent him and follow him would live like. Because in Jesus' day, same as in our day, gates were a defensive structure. They were actually the last line of defense from something that was coming towards you. What Jesus did not say is that the attacks of hell wouldn't overcome the church. He said the gates of hell wouldn't hold it back. And what that means is that the church is not supposed to be what so many people think it is or wish it would be. The church is not meant to be a retreat center where people just get away from the big bad world with like-minded people while we wait for heaven. The church is not supposed to be like a gated community where you got to be perfect and polished before you can be a part kind of thing. The church is meant to, when Jesus says the gates of hell aren't going to prevail against it, what he's saying is that the church, the embodiment of him on the planet, is meant to live exactly the way that Jesus lived, which is by moving, by going to the darkest corners of this world, by entering into the lives of hopeless people and broken people and damaged people, the thieves, the sinners, the tax collectors, the prostitutes, the same people that Jesus made a beeline for and spent so much of his time with during his very short 3-year ministry. And one of the things that I've always been so interested in is the fact that the Pharisees, the Pharisees, the religious leaders in Jesus' day, they had such an issue with the way that Jesus always found himself surrounded by sinners. That really bothered them. But when you read the gospel accounts, a friend of mine was telling me that when he was kind of first taking his steps in the faith, he just kind of drowned out all the noise, and he decided he was just going to look at the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He just wanted to really get to know who Jesus is. I think Jesus is one of the most misunderstood characters in history, maybe especially by Christians sometimes. And one thing that so amazes me, I really think this should amaze us, is that sinners were drawn to Jesus. Like every time Jesus opened his mouth, they were crowding around him. They ate meals with him. They reclined at table with him. They fell at his feet. They wanted to be around him. They felt, just consider this, sinners in Jesus' day, meaning the people that were obviously openly broken, they felt more comfortable around the Son of God than they did around the Pharisees who were supposed to be representing God. And what that's always really spoken to me is that if I ever arrive at a place where people can't feel comfortable around me unless they look and live and believe just like me, then there's a good chance I'm more like a Pharisee than I am like Jesus. I mean, that really moves me. Now, in saying that, Jesus never watered the truth down, right? He always shot straight with people. He called things what it was. But what you see in Jesus is that even when he did that, he left people's dignity intact. When he spoke truth to people, he did so in a way that was perfectly timed, and he did so in a way that was full of grace and full of truth at the same time. But so many Christians who claim to represent Jesus and follow Jesus and be like Jesus play this game where they kind of demand that people become just like them and get everything figured out and cleaned up before they can be a part of their lives or a part of their churches. But what we have a tendency to forget is that if Jesus treated us like that, none of us would be in the family of God. None of us. None of us have a resume to get ourselves in the front door, not unless Jesus comes to us first. And that's the difference between the gospel and religion. What you see in Jesus' life is that time after time he entered into the lives of sinners while they were still sinners, while they were still sinning. You think about Zacchaeus, the wee little tax collector. You think about the Samaritan woman at the well. And Pharisees had this, they just could not wrap their mind around the reality that this rabbi could be the Son of God and a friend of sinners at the same time, but he was. And I think one of the problems that Christians have and churches have is that they're not. They're not friends with people that aren't like them. They're not friends with people who live a different lifestyle, who have a different sexual orientation, who view the world through a different lens. But what I'm seeing in just the first half of verse 12 here, with this command to conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, what I'm seeing there is that to be a follower of Jesus does not mean to surround yourself with only the holiest, cleanest, like-minded people that you can find. It's to get out there and do like Jesus, to live out our lives and walk with Jesus among the Gentiles, among people who don't believe like us and don't live like us, because at the end of the day, you cannot impact what you will not approach. Amen? So the second half of verse 12, right after it says, conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, it chases that with this. It says, so that in a case where they speak against you as those who do what is evil, they will, by observing your good works, glorify God on the day of visitation. So once again, how do you live out your faith in front of people who don't share it? This is going to be our third and our final idea this morning. Number 3, we have to trust God to do what only He can do. At the end of this passage, what we have is Peter highlighting really the two responses that people are going to have to your faith. On the one hand, they're going to reject it and you along with it, or on the other hand, they'll come around to glorifying God themselves. But in either case, what is so important to remember is that whatever their response is, it is not up to us. And the reason that is so important for us to remind ourselves of constantly is because when we forget this, what we wind up doing is we start taking responsibility for things that we don't have control over. But I'm positive that there are people right now that you have somebody in your life that's in a really, really bad place. And God has put them in your life, and God has put them on your heart, and your heart breaks for them. And you've prayed for them, and you've talked to them, and you've reached out for them, and more than anything, you want to see them turn the corner. But what's so easy to do is to shift into this mindset where we start believing, well, maybe if I was just better, and maybe if I could just come up with, if I was more articulate and came up with the right string of words and put it in the right order at the right time, then maybe I could turn them around, or maybe I could. And what's happened is you have believed the lie that you're called to be somebody's savior, and you're not. Our role is to love people. Only God can change them. And when we flip that around, we drive ourselves insane. So the last thing that this passage would have us holding on to as we live out our faith in the public square is that we have to, at the end of the day, trust God to do what only He can do. And what I wanted to do as we wind down today is finish off week 1 of this series with a story that was really encouraging to me, and I'm confident that it will be to you as well. So 2 weeks ago, we did something that we call Serve Week. And for those of you that are new to this church, one thing that you should know about us is one of our core values is service in the community. That's something that we try to really make a part of our DNA. And so Serve Week is a week-long thing where, as a church, we partner with more than a dozen local nonprofit organizations, and we just make it really easy for everybody who's a part of this church to get out and serve and basically live like Jesus in the community. So that's what we did. And we get out there without any agendas. You know, we're not trying to jackknife any conversations. We just want to help people the way that Jesus has helped us, is what it boils down to. So on Wednesday of Serve Week, I had the chance to volunteer at an organization I never even really heard of called Hope for All. And so I found myself midday on a Wednesday in the back of a utility van that was towing a trailer full of furniture. And we wheeled it on up to Laurel near the PG line, and we dropped off a whole lot of it to a family who needed it. And that's what Hope for All does. It just donates furniture to families that need it totally free of charge. So, of course, on Wednesday, it was over 100 degrees with the heat index, and I'll be straightforward with you. Unloading furniture out of a trailer and into a non-air-conditioned home in 100-degree weather was not the most pleasant experience in my life. But I will tell you this. When you see a 10-year-old boy come tearing out of a home with a Spider-Man t-shirt on, talking about how excited he is to see his new bunk bed, that heat stops bothering you real fast. Amen? Hit me in the chest. But as impactful as that was to me, I'll tell you that the highlight for Serve Week actually came before it officially launched. Because 2 weeks ago at the end of our 11:30 service, a good friend of mine pulled me aside. And it was very clear to me out the gate that something was on his mind. I kind of had a feeling that something was up. He had this look in his eye and this tone in his voice, and he was kind of talking me through, his experience at Severn and just his experience, in life generally. And, he'd been coming here for about a year, and I was wondering, how I was supposed to respond to this and what I could say. But at the end of the conversation, he bottom lined it for me. He said, so anyway, I just want to let you know that I don't have any more reservations about this, and I'm ready to take my next step in my relationship with Jesus. And I'm not entirely sure exactly how to do that. And so, can you help? And I froze because it's not supposed to be that easy, right? Like it's never on a silver platter like that. So I just looked at him for a second and I said, are you telling me you're ready to give your life to Jesus? And he said, yeah, that's what I'm telling you. And so we prayed right then and there. And just like that, every single one of his sins has been removed as far as the east is from the west. And just like that, he no longer relates to God as a judge, but as a father. And just like that, where he's going to spend eternity has changed forever. And the moment that stops being amazing to me, I'm going to find something else to do. All right? Well, so I want the worship team come on back up, and I'll wind down here. The coolest part of that story for me is that he had been coming here for about a year. And looking back, of course, he would have never said this at the time, but he told me straightforwardly that when he first attended our church, he didn't want nothing to do with this. He was not picking up what we were putting down. He was really only here to support his wife, And even 2 months ago, we went out to a place called The Hideaway in Odenton. Shout out to The Hideaway. It's an amazing restaurant. Not the point of this analogy, but it's an amazing restaurant. About 2 months ago, we're sitting there at lunch at The Hideaway, and he's telling me, like, hey, man, there's still some things that I can't quite wrap my head around. And this doesn't entirely make sense to me and I can't connect this dot. And I just kind of nodded and smiled and said, hey, man, if I was coming in cold, I'd probably say a few of the same things myself. That was just 2 months ago. But this week, that same guy was in my office giving me ideas of what we can do as a church so we can get more people in here and one more person can come to know Jesus like he knows Jesus now. That is incredible to me. That's what a life transformed by Jesus looks like. But the reason that I tell that story is because it illustrates this really powerful and this really encouraging truth that I really think some of us might need to hear, and I really hope this picks you up this week. What that story proves is that any day can be the day that God gets through to somebody that you love. Any day can be the day that God reaches somebody you've been praying for, maybe crying for, maybe getting ready to die for. You want to see them come to Jesus. And our responsibility, just based on this passage, is from this day until whenever that day might be, is to walk alongside of them and show them something that they have never, ever seen before, which is a life that's been transformed by Jesus. Because the sobering truth that this passage rests on is the reality that the life that we live matters. The life that we live can be the catalyst through which God gets a hold of somebody that we love. And this is exactly what Jesus taught in Matthew 5:16, when he said, let your light so shine before men that they might see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. And the only way to live a life that shines before people, the only way to live a life that shines before your parents, before your kids, before the person you're married to, before the people that you love, is if you first have the man who claimed himself to be the light of the world lighting up your life. And so we're going to play one more song this morning. And if you're here and you have not given your life to Jesus, let me just say something that might weird you out. It is entirely possible that God has engineered and orchestrated all the events in your life to bring you right here, right now, so that you could do exactly what my friend did 2 weeks ago, which is give your life to Jesus. And if you're ready to do that, we got a response team that would love to talk with you and pray with you. But for those of us that already have, wondering how we can live in such a way that God might do for someone else what he's done for us, what this passage would say to us is, first off, focus on yourself before you focus on anybody else. Secondly, meet people where they are instead of where you think they should be. But thirdly and finally, trust God to do what only he can do, because any day could be the day that he gets through to somebody that you love. All right? That's it. That's all.